Hello, good evening. If you haven't already found it, there's coffee and water. I know that it says no food or drink in the chapel, but I think most of us have already broken that rule. Maybe not. Maybe I'm not supposed to say that, but I think you can bring coffee in here.
We won't tell you.
Okay, good. You have coffee and water already. My name's Derek Moyer, and I teach in the Humanities Department here at Warner. Welcome to this forum on the theological and ethical perspectives of the use of genetically modified organisms in agriculture. We are excited to be working again with the Ecumenical Ministries of Oregon's Interfaith Food and Farm Partnership, who is co-hosting this event. Thanks also goes to Warner Pacific's Department of Humanities, Department of Religion, and Department of Natural Sciences and Health, who are co-sponsoring the forum and providing financial support. Concerns and debate about genetically modified organisms has intensified in Oregon in recent months, as you've noticed if you watch any network television, as we will be voting in November on ballot measure 92, which would require the labeling of most foods containing genetically modified organisms. No doubt many of us in this room already feel strongly about the justice or injustice, the efficacy or inefficacy of this measure. Indeed, in the interest of clear disclosure, in other contexts, Ecumenical Ministries of Oregon is doing advocacy work related to Measure 92. But our concern tonight is not specifically about Measure 92, nor even about the question of whether foods containing GMOs should be labeled. This event is not intended to advocate for a particular way of thinking about GMOs. Our intention is to continue an ecumenical dialogue about the moral and theological frameworks that we think are useful for talking reasonably, graciously, and justly about the role that GMOs do and will play in our agricultural systems. Too often, our voices and concerns about important moral questions are reduced to the tendencies of polarized and polarizing political debate in American culture. This forum is intended to resist such reductive thinking and instead to seek to understand how we should think morally and theologically about GMOs. It's important to make a distinction here. This forum is not intended to say what we should think about GMOs, but these are the habits and practices of thinking informed by our moral and theological traditions that are useful for talking about GMOs. Our panelists tonight have been invited to talk with us in this spirit, and I invite all of us to enter into this dialogue tonight in a spirit of open and gracious dialogue seeking understanding. In other words, we are trying to practice dialogue tonight, not end it. Of course, that we are seeking dialogue does not mean that we are abdicating our commitments. We will hear tonight from individuals who have strong convictions about GMOs and whose voices represent strong commitments in our religious traditions. This is as it should be, because dialogue requires that we have something to say and somewhere to start. We must be invested and to see how we are implicated in the question we seek to answer. I am very fond of the way that Socrates describes dialogue in Plato's Republic, not as a battle to be won, but as a journey to be taken together. And Socrates always looked for people to talk with. So tonight, we are going to talk with some people who have something to say about genetically modified organisms and the moral and religious frameworks that should inform our thinking about them. Our evening will be divided into three parts. In the first part, Dr. David Terrell, professor of physical science at Warner Pacific College, will give a brief introduction of GMOs, which will be followed by a Q&A period. Following this presentation, a panel will address some of the scientific, economic, and agricultural implications of the use of GMOs, which will also be followed by a Q&A. Finally, a panel of faith leaders from Portland will address questions of GMOs from their own moral and faith perspectives. A final Q&A time will follow this panel and conclude our event. So, on behalf of the Interfaith Food and Farm Partnership and Warner Pacific College, welcome and thank you for being here. Before Dr. Terrell begins, Rabbi Deborah Kolodny will bless our time together.
So it may come as no surprise that there is no ancient Hebrew blessing regarding GMOs. So I would like to start the evening with a modern prayer about our relationship with the earth in general, and we're going to sing this together. The melody goes like this. Lie, 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 respond. Lie, 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 lie. Lie, lie, lie. Lie, lie, lie. Lie, 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 lie. Don't repeat. Now with the words. Love the earth. Love the sky. Heat of fire. Drop of water. I can feel it in my body, in my spirit, and in my soul. Now this time, join with me on the last two lines. You ready? First it's responsive, then it's all together. Love the earth, love the sky, heat of fire, drop of water. I can feel it in my body, in my spirit, and in my soul. So you get the idea. The earth, the sky, fire and water, all the elementals exist, and we are in direct, intimate relationship with them. So there is no ancient Hebrew scripture on GMOs, but there is ancient Hebrew scripture on our relationship with the earth. And in fact, tonight starts the holiday, the holy day of Shmini Atzeret, which is the last day of Sukkot, which is a week-long festival devoted to bringing rain. For the last week, those of us who are observant Jews shook our lulav with our etrog together in the 6 directions. You might recognize that the sound this makes is that of a rain stick. This morning, we completed our use of the lulav and the etrog, and when we were done, we beat the willows on the ground. So we're not shaking them anymore. I'm not going to shake them for you tonight, but I'm going to use the maraca to get that energy and sound of the rain stick. So this morning was Hoshana Rabbah when we did 7 hakafot, 7 circles, and we declared, save us, Hoshana, 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 with me, Hoshana, 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 Hoshana. Here are the words of one of the circlings of this morning's ritual. Let's start together. Hoshana, 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 Hoshana. Hoshana Adam uvahema. Hoshana, Hoshana. Please save human and animal. Please save. Hoshana, 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 Hoshana. Hoshana, Gid ve'etzem ve'korma, Hoshana. Hoshana, 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 Hoshana. Please save sinew and bone and knit. Later on, Hoshana, 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 Hoshana. Hoshana ziv v'to'ar v'koma, Hoshana. Please save radiance and beautiful form and fullness of stature. This is talking about all of creation. Hoshana, 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 Hoshana. Hoshana, Chidush Panei Ha'adama, Hoshana. Hosanna, 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 Hosanna. Please save, renew the face of the earth. May it be so, and may our conversation tonight lead us ever more clearly and more definitively into right relationship with all of creation, allowing the earth to give forth her abundance and allowing us to partake of that bounty. And let us say, Amen.
Thank you so much. Good evening, everybody. My name is David Terrell. I am professor of physical science here at Warren Pacific. I would like to start by saying that I am biased. As a scientist, of course, I was educated thinking about the goodness of science, and that's where my bias comes from. I do believe that everybody has a little bit of bias, so I just want to say that me too, right? So what I would like to do is very briefly talk a little bit about why do we do what we do related to genetically modified organisms. So let me start by showing you a picture of a pickup truck that I saw last year in my visit to Leavenworth, Washington. I believe it's a 1928 Ford. But what is interesting about this pickup here is that if you focus on the license plate, you see that it says horseless carriage. Think about it. Why would they say horseless carriage to try to identify this self-propelled vehicle? Because they were really happy. They found the solution for pollution. There was a big problem with pollution at the beginning of the 20th century. Think about Portland in 1920 and so on, right? You could hardly walk around the streets there, Morrison, and it would be kind of very polluted. So they thought this is a great thing. And I think it was, because since that time, we have had ambulances, fire trucks, mail delivered by self-propelled cars, and so on. So it has been the history of recent years that we have developed technologies that have been solving problems related to the environment. 100 years later, though, we find that these automobiles are a problem. And my background here comes from my 14 years of working for the Petroleum Institute. And I used to do research for the oil companies in Mexico as I was teaching also at the National University there. And I became an environmentalist because I knew that even with the best intentions, you can do a lot of damage to the environment. And this is why I am now here, very happy and honored to be invited. Thank you so much for inviting me to talk to you this evening. So with that in mind, that framework there, let me say one thing about the evolution of these genetically modified organisms, because we have been doing it for a long time. First of all, let us define genetically modified organisms, if we can. And in general, we can say, well, things that have been modified at the gene molecular level. And that, of course, we can do now because the technology has advanced so much that we can actually look at molecules. We have very powerful electron microscopes, NMRs, nuclear magnetic resonance apparatus and so on, that we can actually look at the structure of genes and that are the carriers of heredity. So we can define the genes as these molecular units that carry the ID of the organism in terms of the hereditary phenotypic trait, as Mendel started doing this in the 1800s, looking at heredity. So we have been modifying organisms for a long time. In many ways, you could say that we have been doing it naturally. And that's, I think, one of the problems that we face right now is in how do we define naturally. And of course, as a scientist, as a chemist, I think chemistry is natural. But we have this new word that we call synthetic when we talk about things that we can actually make in the laboratory. So grafting, for instance, has been around for a long time. And you could say that the reason that we do it would be because we get better quality and so on. So the main thing here, and by the way, the picture that you can see on the right there is the tree outside of Chapel here. It's a grafted tree that has two colors in the same tree. It's a beautiful thing that we have here in our campus. As you go out, it's going to be dark, but as you go out, you can have a look at that, right? The other picture is my favorite fruit, is the avocado. And the one that you see there is the original avocado in Oaxaca, which it is really delicious, but it's not very nice in the texture and so on. So when you look at these properties, like texture, flavor, size, and so on, you start thinking about why we do these things. Why do we want to change the organism in order for us to, according to us humans, to be better? That would be the main thing. So this would be a list of a very few things about why do we need genetically modified organisms, right? And of course, as humans, we're always looking for novelty. You know, what is new, right? Can I get an apple that tastes like orange, right? An orange apple or something like that, right? And we do. That's what we are always looking after, right? Later on, of course, we have the fortune of being able to listen to, a forum about the ethical value of doing that kind of thing. But it is in our human nature to do that. But from the old way of modifying organisms, we have moved really fast to what we call now engineering. That would be the synthetic aspect, doing things in the laboratory and so on, right? So we're now facing a much powerful and faster way of changing organisms. It started pretty recently, in the 70s. For our young students here, probably they were not even born there, but it is in the history of humankind a very, very short time. The 70s, just a few years ago, when we start doing these things at the molecular level. And in 1974, for instance, a German-born Rudolf Gehenich doctor, he created the first genetically modified animal. He was working with mice. And he was able to go to the DNA, work to the basic hereditary structure of these mice, and change the structure in order for these animals to be more resistant to diabetes and other diseases. And at the same time, Boyer, who co-founded Genentech, which is today one of the biggest companies in technology related to genetically modified organisms, he started a company based on the fact that he was able to synthesize insulin that was very useful, and it is very useful for people with diabetes, right? So this insulin was genetically modified in the sense that was produced by genetically modified bacteria. So we're now talking about working with these molecules that you can think molecules are really, really small, right? But we are now able to manipulate the way that they develop and structure and react between them, right? So this, we call them monomers when you're thinking about a single molecule. Monomers can be put together in a chain to become polymers, and polymers are what we use for making any synthetic fiber and so on, right? And in some cases, you could even say that we are able to make substances that are better than what nature makes in its own. And now I am kind of being blasphemous in a way, right? But think about this. I am a motorcycle rider. And you know, motorcyclists like leather, right? As you can see. But so it happens that we are now able to make jackets from Kevlar, which is a synthetic product that breathes better than leather, is more resistant. In fact, you can make Kevlar that is bulletproof. So for a motorcycle rider, a Kevlar jacket is better than a leather jacket, right? That is what I am trying to say, that some things that we are able to make are better than what you can get in nature, right? And the other thing about this is that when you look at the whole process, what we call from cradle to grave, it might be better for the environment because, for instance, in the case of leather, we use chromates to treat leather, you know, to make the skin become leather and so on. And the chromates are a producer of hexavalent chrome that is a very poisonous, damaging to the environment element. So avoiding the chromates in the leather production, you are being good to the environment, right? So that would be the thing that we have to consider here as we look at the whole picture. Now, I'm going to spend just a few seconds here talking about some of the technologies. I'm not going to really get into the detail. If anybody is interested, we can talk about it later on. But there are basically two ways of doing things. The very rudimentary way is by sheer force with something that we call a gene gun. And the picture on the right there is, I took it from Wikipedia, by the way. I'm giving credit to Wikipedia here. Is a way of getting these genes that you make in the laboratory from a particular organism, and you put them into very tiny little tungsten balls, metals that would not react with the gene, right? And microscopic balls, and then you fire these balls into the cells that you want to modify, and some of these cells will pick up the gene, and then they would become transgenic. The new genetic modification, the new genetic structure would be now what you want to make for that plant. Let me give you an example. In the 90s, there was a big problem with the papaya in Hawaii. They got a virus, the ring spot virus, and plants cannot be vaccinated. You cannot give medicine to plants, right? So the only thing that you can do in order to stop from any pest would be to use pesticides. But this ring spot virus was really difficult to stop. So the only way that scientists from Hawaiian, I think it's the Hawaiian State University, big university in Hawaii, they decided, let us try to change the genes in the papaya to make a transgenic papaya. And they use a very common bacillus, the Bacillus thuringiensis, which is used as a pesticide. It's very commonly used as pesticides. But instead of using the Bacillus as the pesticide, because it was not working, what they did, they injected a gene from the Bacillus into the papaya. And that then produced that the papaya became resistant to the virus, and it saved an industry. My other point here would be probably it was a mistake to have the papaya as a monoculture, but that's another thing, right? But related to saving the industry, they were able to save it in that way. Well, using the same technique, the gene gun, you can do many things, you know, like as I mentioned before. The other technique is more sophisticated, is newer, is less certain today. We have a lot to work to do with the biochemical, but it is also happening. And in that case, you can go even further. And that's where I'm going to stop now, thinking about what comes next, you know, what the future would be. So we have had some successes by producing some plants that are resistant to certain pests. BT corn is one example. And I'm not going to get into the economics or politics. I know that there are experts that are going to be talking a little bit about that today. I'm really glad that we're going to be talking about that. But from the technical point of view, we can do these things. And the BT corn, the BT cotton, for instance, is another very good example, because if you think of cotton as a natural fiber, you would think, oh, cotton is great for the environment. Well, the problem is that cotton is one of the highest users of pesticides. So natural cotton really is terrible for the environment. So what we have to do then is have either a better way of growing cotton, that could be the BT cotton, or, which is not perfect, by the way, because the BT cotton is only strong against certain pests, not all the pests, so they have to, use pesticides anyway. But maybe use some kind of petroleum-based fibers, nylons and so on. That would be the other thing. As a chemist, of course, I am always inclined to use chemicals. So that's my bias, okay? By the way, I would like to say just one final word about language, because it's really important, I think. We all laugh when I said about chemicals. And chemicals have gotten a really terrible name. And if you think about it, it's really sad, because chemicals are everywhere. Everything is chemistry, right? Water is a chemical, right? So one thing I would like you to keep in mind is that we have to be really careful with our language. And as we're trying to label things, as GMOs, for instance, we have to be really careful about that, right? And on the other hand, we have to have the information available, so we have to be literal about that, so we have to be able to know what is going on. So that's where I'm going to stop here. This is what I think is going to happen in the near future, and I am really excited for my students. They are getting into a wonderful time into biochemistry and so on, but I think it's important to always have a framework that we're going to be having that conversation today about the moral, ethical, religious aspect of these things. Thank you so much.
Anybody have any questions for Dr. Terrell?
I've seen that most of the scientific organizations, such as the American Association for the Advancement of Science, has stated in very clear ways that there's no inherent risk in eating foods that have been developed by GE. Is that your position also, or do you have a comment on that?
That is a very, very good question, because indeed, as a chemist or biochemist, you can do a lot of tests about what would happen if somebody digests these kinds of organisms, right? Because you can always break it down to the protein and see if we're able to break the protein to get the energy and so on. And it is true that so far there has not been any evidence of this thing being harmful for humans. And but if you remember the picture that I show up of the car, in 1928, it took us 100 years to see what the problem of having cars was. So it is true that, as far as we know, these organisms we as humans are able to break down these organisms, and also they have been doing tests in other organisms, like with mice or cows and so on. That would be the answer. I don't know if that addresses your question.
Sort of. But we need a 5-minute conversation, which we had.
Yeah, that's the thing. It's looking at the future, I would not know. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So as a biochemist, you, of course, have a laboratory and you have research assistants and you require funding for the research. Not you particularly, I'm just speaking of biochemists in general. And so if you have biochemists who are working on genetically modified organisms, oftentimes their source of funding are companies, multinational corporations such as Monsanto or Genentech, etc. So I guess my question to you is that I'm thinking about the ethics of being funded by a company or multinational corporation which indeed is trying to promote GMOs. So how do you as a scientist navigate those ethics and do research, because that is truly dispassionate and objective, because my understanding is that oftentimes those multinational corporations will discount research that does not agree with their agenda. Thank you.
That's another very good question. And I will have to answer here thinking about what I as a scientist would do if I was in that situation where my research was funded. I mentioned before, I used to work for the petroleum industry, and I know exactly what you mean by that, right? When you work directly for the industry, there are certain things that you can say and certain things that you cannot say. But the thing with research in general is that we are blessed to be in this country where we have money coming from the government, where you have government-funded research that is producing very good, very high-quality research. And with science, we have always the peer review process, where if somebody is going to be publishing something, before the paper is actually published, it has to go through peer review. And I don't know of every case, but I think that in most cases, the peer review is pretty effective by stopping something that is kind of not true and so on. So we have two things. The question, I think, is very important because we have two things. One is the scientific research by itself, and the other one is how do we get funding. And I think that the more people push against having government funding research, the less likely we'll be able to get good research because of what you just said. When companies, it doesn't matter what kind of company it is, if they are funding something, it's because they have vested interest in that. So that is absolutely true. Mm-hmm.
I'm glad you brought up monocropping. 35 years ago, I was working in an entomology lab doing research on biological pest control. And so I'm just wondering if there are any studies that attempted to thwart some of the pest problems you were describing, where GMOs were the remedy, to evaluate whether or not having intercropping or having biological pest control mechanisms could be as effective as the genetically modified approach.
I really don't know a lot of those, but I have seen a few, and I see that small farming with biodiversity, it helps to stop pests, and it stopped also to strengthen the trait of a particular species. So I am a strong advocate for biodiversity in every level. I think that's one of the strengths that we have in nature is diversity. And we don't know enough about how the diverse environment makes a system strong. And I think we need to do more research. But you're absolutely right. There is some evidence that says that having intergrowth of different species will help. And there is another reason why GMOs might be a problem, because they can sort of spread across. Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Just for 1 second, one of our panelists on the next panel is going to be joining us from Eugene, so I have to Skype him really quick. I'm assuming that's his dog. This worked flawlessly like an hour and a half ago, so. Hello.
Hi, Derek.
You are live in front of about 100 people right now. Welcome.
Hi, thank you.
Someone's going to introduce you now.
Okay.
Good evening. I'm very delighted to be here. My name is Reverend Catherine Jesh. I am on the steering committee for the Interfaith Network for Earth Concerns. And this is a really important conversation, so I'm glad you all are here. Our first panelist is talking about issues related to genetically modified organisms is Dr. William Jaeger, professor in the Department of Applied Economics at Oregon State University. And as you can see, he's not in the room. He is in Eugene now. He's an agricultural extension and resource policy specialist. So.
Okay, you're up. I have to
Okay.
tell him what's happening because he can't hear you all, even though you can hear him.
Okay. All right. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here and to be part of this forum. And I'm glad this worked out. And I think I can say this is the first time I've participated in an event in this way through Skype. I noticed that the panel, this is a science panel, and but I want you all to know I'm an economist, and I've spent some time over a few years looking at genetically modified organisms, genetically engineered plants, especially as it relates to agriculture. So what I'd like to do is try to share with you in 10 minutes some of the high points or some of the things that I think I would want to know if I were new to this topic, and especially those things that I think an economist may have looked at, and some of the ways that economists have tried to evaluate GMOs and think about them as an important and controversial policy issue. As you may know, economists tend to think about benefits and costs. We think about trade-offs, we weigh things, and we also think about risks and concepts like fairness, precaution, risk, freedoms, and liabilities. So one of the things I think I can begin with is to talk a little bit about what evidence there is about the way that genetically engineered crops have affected the economy. We tend to recognize that just about any change in society has winners and losers. There are costs and benefits. And so let me try to summarize a few things that I think may be of interest. And I hope I don't repeat too much some of the things that were said in the first session with Professor Terrell. There are a range of crops, things that have been genetically engineered. There are three in the U.S. economy that are quite dominant now: corn, cotton, and soybeans. More than 90% of those three crops, those are three major crops in the U.S., more than 90% of the corn, cotton, and soybeans grown in the U.S. are genetically engineered. There are some other crops, sugar beets and papaya, that are also commercially produced in the U.S. and in other countries. A number of other countries produce commercially genetically engineered crops, those same three that I mentioned, canola, cotton, in China, India, Mexico, and elsewhere. One might want to know, well, what are the benefits of genetically engineered crops to the economy, to consumers, to producers, and to the people who develop them? There's evidence of significant benefits. I'm going to talk first about the benefits and then say a few things about costs, things that we think we can say about costs. There are clear evidence that reduced costs and yield increases have occurred with genetically engineered crops that are insect-resistant crops. There are other kinds of crops that are herbicide-tolerant crops, such as the Roundup-Ready commodities. The evidence is less clear on yield increases. The data, in terms of saying, gee, do we see strong evidence that people who use genetically engineered herbicide-tolerant crops have seen an increase in the yields in production? And that evidence is not so clear, but quite clear for the insect-resistant commodities, the BT crops that use lower amounts and less expensive insecticide applications. So in fact, that's one of the benefits we could point to in the case of those genetically engineered crops. The data, the estimates. So I guess I should say that these genetically engineered crops have been in production for since the late 1990s. So the kinds of research I've looked at have sort of 15 years of experience to draw on. We do see evidence of a 10% increase in cotton yields, 5% for BT corn in some studies. And so that's evidence of benefits that lead to greater productivity, lower food costs, and there has been evidence or estimates trying to tease out the effect of the shift to genetically engineered commodities on prices. One estimate, 13% reduction in prices for corn, 18% for cotton, soybean, a range from 2% to 65%. So one of the things to keep in mind is when I talk about numbers, these are rough numbers. There are only a few studies, and so we don't have large amounts of data to go on. One of the things people are often concerned about and ask about is whether the benefits, if there are benefits to genetically engineered crops, who gets them? Is it the farmers? Is it the consumers? Is it the companies that develop the crops? And the studies I've looked at suggest, well, it's kind of shared among those three, and different studies suggest the proportions are focused differently on consumers and producers. Certainly those who develop the crops share in the benefits. We think in a competitive market, ultimately most of the benefits should end up going to the consumer, that farmers will compete with one another, prices will go down, and so the benefits will accrue ultimately to consumers. So I'm going kind of quickly over some of the pieces of evidence to just give you a kind of an overview. Bottom line, economists like to sort of add it all up and say, well, what can we say are the benefits overall of this introduction of genetically engineered crops in these main commodity areas over the 15-year period where we have data and can look at the estimates in published research. And one estimate, there are very few, one estimate said $30 billion, that for the U.S., the introduction of those three major crops has generated $30 billion worth of net benefits to producers, and then that, of course, carries over and effect is what tends to be transferred to consumers. So that's, in fact, there are a few estimates. That's one. I don't, it's hard to know if that estimate is maybe high or low, but it's an estimate and it gives you a sense. And I think it's reasonable to say, these there are significant benefits in terms of higher productivity and reduced cost to the farmers. There are also some costs or some other kinds of consequences of genetically engineered crops, and those are less easy to quantify, but I'm going to mention a few. One that comes up a lot is health issues, and perhaps in the earlier discussion, it may have been pointed out that there's no confirmed evidence. My understanding is there's no confirmed evidence of negative health effects from eating genetically modified foods. But in science, we can talk about what has happened in the past, what evidence we have had up to this point. We can't be sure about what might happen in the future. So there is a question mark. A lot of scientists don't feel that there's any risk there, but that's outside my area of expertise. Another area is environmental issues. That is, how could the potential that genetically engineered plants could escape, become kind of an invasive species that we have created. Contamination, that kind of environmental effect, which can have both ecosystem effects, but also market effects. Contamination can lead to markets with our trading partners in Europe where they ban genetically engineered commodities. That can lead to adverse market effects on our economy and on farmers in the U.S. One issue that has clearly become more apparent in recent years is that with insect-resistant commodity crops, herbicide-resistant crops, there is going to be some resistance that develops. And glyphosate is the herbicide that is used with these commodities, and we are seeing the spread of weeds that are resistant to glyphosate, and that in turn can lead to a need or a desire to increase production, to increase the use of additional herbicides. The last category that I wanted to say something about in relation to costs has to do with the costs of a couple of ways of putting it. One is the cost of imposing risks on society and risks on groups of people who would prefer not to have those risks imposed on them. We have this labeling bill in Oregon. A lot of people believe that one should have a right to know whether they're buying genetically engineered commodities when they go to the supermarket. So a right to know, individual choices. We have something we know what we call the precautionary principle, the idea that we should be very sure that there is no risk or a very, very small risk before we allow certain kinds of activities. In Europe, there is a very strong ethic around a precautionary principle, and so genetic engineering is almost entirely banned in Europe because it is felt that the potential risks, even if we haven't seen harmful effects in the environment or elsewhere thus far, caution should err on the side of protecting those people who don't want to be exposed to those risks, who don't want the environment to have to be exposed to those risks. We tend in the United States not to be as strongly supportive of that kind of precautionary principle. Many people certainly agree with that point of view, but others do not. And my last point, I just wanted to talk for 10 minutes and then stop. The last point I will make is that many of my colleagues, scientists, genetic scientists, suggest that genetic engineering is no different than traditional plant breeding that has been done on experiment stations. And they feel that, DNA is moved around all the time. We've done it for centuries. And so they don't see a difference. And I think one of the arguments that I've heard, and this is certainly not drawing on my economic expertise, but it resonates with me, and that is that in the case of genetic engineering going forward, genetic engineering allows one to take DNA from a plant and put it in an animal and put it in a plant, or from a bacteria into an. And so the range there, to me, there is a qualitative difference in the range of changes in DNA that can be made. There's a lot of uncertainty, a lot of things we don't know about the potential side effects or effects of that kind of genetic engineering that we haven't done before. And so being cautious, taking on the precautionary principle with respect to this very relatively new kind of changes in DNA, that seems like a reasonable argument to be made on that side. So I think I'll stop there. I just wanted to throw out some ideas, and I look forward to the rest of the discussion.
Okay, thank you. So if it's okay with you, we're going to leave you on the big screen while Mr. Molesky presents, and then you two will field questions.
Sure.
Okay.
Ivan Molesky is the Executive Director of Friends of Family Farms, and he's going to be discussing possible impacts of GMOs on small farms and sustainable agriculture, and what folks in that industry are concerned about.
All right, well, I'd like to thank Ecumenical Ministries of Oregon and Warner Pacific for putting on this forum tonight. Hopefully, I will help illuminate some things for all of you. So just a little background. I farm in Lynn County on about 70 acres. We raise hay, we do pasture-raised pork and poultry, do some vegetables now and again. I'm also the director of Friends of Family Farmers, which is the state's largest independent family farm organization. We represent about 1,000 farmers and ranchers across Oregon. And I was appointed to the governor's task force on genetically engineered agriculture earlier this year, specifically to try to represent farmers that have concerns about lax oversight of genetically engineered crops and how they're being managed currently. And I should say that I don't speak for the task force. The task force is very diverse. People who have a very wide range of views. So I can only really represent myself, and I'll do that to the best of my ability. So as I mentioned, Friends of Family Farmers represents about 1,000 farmers and ranchers across Oregon. We have developed our policy positions by listening to farmers. And one of the things that we've heard for several years is that the federal and state oversight of genetically engineered crops is lax. It's arguably broken. In fact, there really is no state oversight at all. And at the federal level, you've got 3 different federal agencies that look at these issues. They look at different pieces of it, and it sometimes looks like they're not coordinating very well, and that ultimately the public interest is not placed at the top of the agenda. In fact, it oftentimes appears that the approach of the federal agencies that are charged with reviewing and approving these crops and the foods in the marketplace are essentially being a rubber stamp for industry. And so we feel this voice is very important. When I talk about us being an independent family farm organization, I do that because we don't take money from Monsanto or some of the other food companies that are opposing, for example, this labeling measure. But you can look up the facts. A number of the farm organizations in this state do take money from those sources, and not too shockingly, they have a different view on these issues. So we work with small to mid-sized farmers across Oregon. I guess I wanted to give you a little bit of background on Oregon agriculture because I feel it's really important to not just discuss these issues in the abstract. A lot of time, it rubs me the wrong way when we get into the hypotheticals of this, when we talk about things in very general terms. The commodity crops that we've heard talk about, soy, cotton, nobody in Oregon grows those, okay? Our farmers aren't producing those crops. That's southern United States, Midwest type, those are the types of crops they produce there. It's not that you can't grow soy here, it's just not commercially viable. Another big one, corn, is another huge genetically engineered crop. The fact is, the corn that we do grow in Oregon, we don't know how much of it's genetically engineered or not because nobody tracks it once it's been deregulated by the federal government. And I would argue that because we do a lot of sweet corn here for the food processing industry, and some of those big companies actually have sworn off GMOs, that a lot of our corn here, unlike the Midwest, is not genetically engineered. Oregon's a small farm state. We are not the Midwest. And so that's really important here for the context on how these issues affect us here in Oregon. Oregon farmers, unlike the Midwest, where there may be 2 or 3 major commodity crops, again, often genetically engineered, we've got over 200 crops in production here. The Willamette Valley that we live in now is, here we're at the northern section of, is one of the top, most people don't know this, we are one of the top specialty vegetable seed producing regions in the world. That means that if you bought some lettuce from California, or you were in Japan eating some cabbage, odds are that the seeds were actually grown here by farmers in the Willamette Valley. And this has been a huge issue because seeds are in fact one of the big areas of controversy around how we manage these issues. Farmers here are supplying seed to backyard gardeners, they're supplying seed to farmers nationally and farmers internationally as well. And it's why, and I should back up a little bit because as a farm organization, we work on a lot of issues. One of the bills that we were responsible for in 2013 was we helped pass a beginning farmer loan program through the legislature. We've helped actually reduce, we've actually helped reduce regulatory barriers to farmers that want to sell direct to consumer. In the past, it's been very hard to do some of these things. We've struggled with this issue around genetic engineering, in part because our members support transparency, and they believe the oversight system is broken, but also because we've had some real challenges in Oregon with the way that the government agencies have dealt with the issue. Some of you may remember that just last year there was a bill in a special session to preempt local communities from being able to make some of these food and farm decisions on their own. We opposed that bill because we feel like folks have the right to be involved in their food and agricultural systems. And one of the other things that we parted ways with some of the other agribusiness groups is this issue of canola, and I'm going to kind of tie this together here. Canola is one of the big genetically engineered commodity crops. As I mentioned with the Willamette Valley and our specialty seed region, farmers, conventional, organic, even some GMO producers have very strong concerns about canola. And it's specifically, and in fact, it was such a strong concern that we were able to ban it legislatively across 3 million acres in the Willamette Valley in 2013. It was frankly a historic alliance of farming interests and food interests that got together and said, we are going to threaten our agricultural systems here if we allow canola in. Now, canola has a lot of issues. It's got plant diseases that it shares with a lot of our seed crops. It can get mixed in with our cover seed crops that we sell to the Midwest. But the fact that roughly 85% of the canola in this country is engineered to be resistant to Roundup herbicide is of major concern because we have weeds in the same plant family in this valley, the mustard family, as canola is. So what you run the risk of doing if you allow canola in is that we could suddenly create a weed problem that we can't control because herbicides no longer work. And so you have both the issue of cross-contamination with seed crops, where purity is essential. If you're going to grow ahead of, let's see, Savoy cabbage, you want that to be true to type. But you also have this issue of outcrossing and cross-pollination with weeds, which is a very serious economic risk for Oregon farmers. So another few facts about Oregon farms that I want to say is, I mentioned we're a small farm state. Over 60% of our farms are under 50 acres in size. Over 70% are under 100 acres in size. We've got about 38,000 farms in Oregon. Oregon's #1 crops, whether it be, it's a lot of specialty crops like hazelnuts, a lot of the berry crops, sweet cherries, blackberries. None of these crops are genetically engineered. And so a lot of our seed crops, again, we're growing them to sell to markets where genetic engineering is unwanted. And so, and I would even say that, interestingly enough, one of our big crops is grass seed, which is not a food crop. And there's only currently one rule in place in Oregon that actually restricts genetic engineered seed specifically, and that is we have a ban also in the Willamette Valley on genetically engineered bent grass. Again, resistant to the herbicide Roundup. The entire Willamette Valley, our grass seed industry, $300 million a year industry, is protected through administrative ban on bent grass, which is a grass variety that has been engineered by the Scott's company to resist Roundup. So I'm trying to give you a little context here, and I guess one other piece, I'm going to keep kind of going with these stats, but Oregon we have a lot of organic farms here. So organic agriculture uniquely is impacted by genetic engineering. Genetic engineering is not allowed in organic production, and so especially if you're growing organic seed crops, you have a lot of risk to your markets. Oregon's ranked 6th in the nation in the number of organic farms. We're consistently one of the top 5 states in terms of economic value of our organic industry. In 2012 alone, there were over 550 organic farms who had sales valued at $200 million here in Oregon. That's up from $88 million 5 years earlier. So we have a thriving, growing organic sector in the state. Nationally, the organic sector sales rose 10% between 2011 and 2012. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry now. So in a lot of these farms, these organic farms have been around for more than 10 years. A lot of farmers have actually found that there's a lot of economic value in switching over. So we would argue that, frankly, all these factors come to the place where Oregon farmers have far more to lose from poorly managed genetic engineering than we have to gain. And in fact, we really need some sideboards in place. And so that's why when we're on the task force that the governor's created, we advocate for new rules that will provide better oversight at the state level, and we advocate new rules at the federal level. We also believe that transparency and labeling is not only a fundamental right for consumers, but it helps protect farmers because it helps us distinguish our Oregon-grown farm products from a lot of the commodity processed foods that you see, because if it's got corn syrup in it or cornstarch or soy oil, it's probably genetically engineered. But again, we're not really growing those crops here in Oregon. So kind of circling around, there's some bigger issues. So there were some of the previous discussions talked about some of the perceived benefits for these crops. And again, I would say that that's not been felt here among Oregon farmers. We've seen a lot of the negative impacts. Our wheat industry was threatened by a wheat crop that was never approved or was never meant to be approved for commercial production just last year when we found genetically engineered, again, Roundup resistant wheat growing in eastern Oregon. And it threatened our wheat crop here, which is, again, a $300 million export industry. We've seen it with our specialty seed industry in canola, and we've seen it in the area of alfalfa as well, which is a hay crop that's used in dairies. But again, a lot of our export partners don't tolerate any GMO. And the unique issue here, I think, is, and the real risk comes in with these open pollinated crops, the crops that are pollinated by wind or pollinated by insects. And that's where we need to be especially careful. So, in other words, well, it's kind of, I guess, Dave Maynard says, but there's no free lunch on this stuff. There's been a lot of benefits discussed around genetically engineered crops in the past. And frankly, to the extent that any of them have been real, they've often been temporary. So there was promises that we'd see a huge reduction in pesticide use. In fact, we've seen a huge increase in pesticide use with the Roundup Ready crops. I think it's important to note that that most of the crops that are approved for market now are related to some sort of pesticide trait, whether it's resistance to an herbicide or whether it's actually to include an insecticide in the plant itself. Even with some of the insect-resistant crops, we're starting to see insects developing tolerance. And so some of the best practices in the Midwest where you're starting to see this is they're saying, well, go ahead, plant your BT corn or your BT cotton, but go ahead and spray the insecticides or apply it in the soil as well, because you need to be double sure, because we're starting to see resistance growing. And I guess what this ends up putting us on is sort of what we call this pesticide treadmill. So we've created this wave of crops that are resistant to certain herbicides. We're now seeing a massive problem with herbicide resistance that is directly related to, I'd say, the overuse of these genetically engineered crops, because it's a cropping system. It's intended to be a monoculture. It's intended to be sprayed with more chemicals in the case of the herbicide-resistant crops. What you get when you have that issue going on is herbicide-resistant weeds develop, because only the ones that survive are the ones that continue to breed. So right now, roughly 61 million acres of American farmland are contaminated with herbicide-resistant weeds. And one of the things that's been sort of a revelation to me, being on the governor's task force, is the federal system for kind of policing this stuff is extremely lacking. So what the federal process is essentially they take a company's request to develop a new crop or a new herbicide, and they essentially process that request and move towards approval. So in the case of Roundup resistant weeds, just this week, the EPA has now approved a new herbicide that's meant to be used with corn that has 2,4-D in it. And 2,4-D is a much more toxic chemical. It's much more harmful to farm workers who have to handle the crops. And it's actually an herbicide that can volatilize in hot weather, literally leave in a cloud and drop over onto other crops. And we've had major problems with crop damage from 2,4-D in the past. And so as we see these new crops approved for more toxic herbicides, we're on this treadmill where we're going to this increased intensity. And so I know I have to wrap it up. So I wanted to flag a few things just the examples to tie it together. So with the Food and Drug Administration in particular, they're the ones ostensibly charged with approving safety. I don't think most people realize that safety review is actually voluntary. Companies do not, by law, have to go through it. So there could end up being genetically engineered crops on the store shelves that have never actually gone through FDA approval. Now, when you do go through the voluntary FDA approval, essentially you as the company are the one who makes the safety determination, and the FDA does not do any independent science or anything particularly long-term in order to confirm that. And so they're sort of affirming the company's decision to call it safe. That doesn't give me a lot of comfort, and it doesn't give a lot of folks a lot of comfort. And it's part of the reason why you see this call for more transparency. And in conclusion, I will say that we view sort of this labeling topic in the same way that we view something like country of origin labeling. So right now we have laws on the books that require that if your meat or your vegetable produce is produced in another country or in the US, it has to be labeled as such. It's simply a piece of information, helps people make a more informed choice. I don't know all the safety issues around GMOs. I think the jury, frankly, is still out on some of these issues because there hasn't been the long-term science done. I certainly hope I've helped make the case that there are real risks for Oregon farmers. So for a lot of these reasons, we think that it's important to have transparency in the marketplace. It's the only way a free market works is with information. And when folks are trying to tell you that we can't have the information, I think you have to look at where that sort of financial backing is coming from and why they're saying it. And ultimately, we think it's good for people to have information. They can make whatever choice they want when they have accurate information. So thank you.
A lot to think about. Now we have a few minutes for questions and answers. I'm going to bring the microphone around. There we go. And if you'll raise your hand, I'll hand you the mic. And then we're going to repeat the questions up here so that our guest on Skype can hear what we're asking.
Ask questions that can be easily repeated.
Yeah, please.
So I've grown up eating genetically modified papaya my whole life. And in my hometown, I've been seeing a lot of, in Hawaii, we've been seeing a lot of protests lately on genetically modified organisms, particularly corn. Now, my question is, and I'm seeing this, maybe there's an economic reason for this, more than just scientific. Why protest corn when there's been, or other such crops, when there's been papaya sitting in the supermarket that's been genetically modified for decades?
So do I need to repeat that for Yvonne?
Good.
So did you hear that question?
Parts of it, I couldn't hear it all.
So the basic question was, we've had papaya on the market for decades, which is engineered to resist the ring spot virus. Why are folks protesting corn, for example, when we've had some of these crops on the market for decades? That's roughly the question. And I will take a stab at that first. I think that there are some examples where crops have been engineered for a different purpose than an herbicide resistance. I think that it is sometimes the case that it all gets lumped together. I think that the fact that a very high percentage of the crops nowadays are engineered to relate to a company's preferred pesticide application is really where the crux of the issue is. And I think that, for example, there's going to be a non-browning apple, okay, that's going to likely be on the market soon. So I don't know why you'd want a non-browning apple, but some folks perhaps do. But it's controversial amongst farmers because there's a lot of concern. What could this mean to our apple industry? So, it is important to remember not all traits are related to these herbicide traits. I think those are, however, the vast majority. I think that's demonstrated, and I think that truly is where a lot of the controversy comes. And I think that particularly when you talk about crop management, and this is where I think policymakers are going to have to struggle, and I hope they do struggle with this, because I feel like what we've done is avoid these questions for quite a long time. But you have to struggle with the question is, open pollinated crops that have herbicide traits that could spread into the environment, frankly, do pose a lot more of an environmental risk than maybe a crop that is engineered for some other purpose. But in practical reality, because there's such a profit motive behind the pesticides that are typically associated with the crops, that's where you get a lot of the research and development that does occur. So that's my attempt to answer that question, is why isn't there so much controversy around one crop versus another? Did you want to try to answer that, David, William?
Well, I think you did a good job in terms of whether, papaya being around for a long time, maybe it's more on lots of people's radar screens now, given the when we've gone to these three major crops, 90% of the production is genetically engineered. That's a very different market and landscape effect than a few papayas or other uses of genetic engineering, which I think you make a good point. It's good to point out that all uses of genetic engineering aren't these sort of production and herbicide, insecticide management kinds of attributes. I think one of the first genetically engineered uses of genetic engineering was vitamin fortification of some kind. I'm forgetting the specifics, but there are lots of different ways that genetic engineering can do good things.
And I'll tack on one last thing is, it's only very recently that we've begun to do a lot more rigorous review at all. So, for example, we grow a lot of sugar beet seed in Oregon that's now genetically engineered for sugar production in the Midwest. That was actually being grown in fields before there was significant federal approval here in Oregon. It's very controversial, a lot of legal battles. That began a lot of awareness, I think, for folks here in Oregon around some of the controversies and the economic issues. And I believe 2011 was the first time there was even an environmental impact statement done on a GMO crop. So even just the trying to get to more rigorous analysis is something very recent.
Well, one thing I think with his example about the papayas and the corn is used in so many things. It's corn syrups and everything, and I'm under the understanding that there have been a lot of I don't know the exact number of years, a time frame where we have seen a lot of increases of certain diseases. Well, the common ones, diabetes and obesity and all these things, but we can't prove these things, and maybe that's one question I have is when you were saying we've done this, like I know we've done this with salmon, and they're thinking of, I don't know if there's a company I know, Aqua something, and they're doing it with salmon, and the salmon are really big, and they're worried about them spreading into the other with the other salmon, and that they said they're going to make them sterile, and then I just, what other things have, okay, you said we've done this with other things. We've used other genetic, things that are on the market. Okay, with Roundup, okay, it's an insecticide. Okay, we're eating, okay, it's changed the gene, I'm understanding. Is there Roundup in the seed then there's Roundup in the seed, and these other things that were modified or changed through genetics, what were they used with an insecticide too? Or was it changed in a way that was just like when you say breeding dogs and stuff like that, where they want the dog taller? But this is in a way of, this is a chemical that seems a lot different.
I'm not sure if you heard much of that, Bill.
Yes,
but,
I was able to hear that one.
I'll use this as an opportunity to bring up something that I did not mention in my remarks. And so issues around pesticide residue, I think in our food is maybe one kind of aspect of that. I heard around, is there Roundup in the seeds, for example? This is where the federal system gets strange, because when the United States Department of Agriculture approves crops for, let's say, spraying Roundup on it, it'll survive Roundup, it normally would have died. They acknowledge that there may be herbicide resistance, or there may be some buildup of this herbicide in the environment. But then they say, we don't have anything, we can't do anything about it. That's the Environmental Protection Agency's job. When you go to the Environmental Protection Agency, they are saying, well, we monitor that through, we look for the companies to tell us when this herbicide resistance has emerged, and then we follow up with them on that. So it's very much kind of reported by the company. But in particular, I wanted to call your attention. In 2013, the Environmental Protection Agency actually raised the amount of Roundup, so this is the glyphosate herbicide in the Roundup Ready crops, that's allowed as residue in some foods. And at the Genetically Engineered Task Force of the governor, we pressed them on this question, like, why did you do that? Why did you do that? And ultimately, they admitted that they did it because with the GMO cropping system, it's expected that you're going to spray the Roundup herbicide later and closer to the time that people eat it. And so the EPA actually raised the level of Roundup that's allowed in residue of some crops, like beets, for example. Now, they're quick to say they're still within safe levels, but it's very alarming to us that you would have a federal regulatory agency actually increase the allowable amount of residue because specifically they understand there's more of this herbicide that's going to be sprayed. So.
We have time for one more. Does anybody have a burning question? I'm going to go to this one back here.
I don't know how long you could spend on this, but is it possible to have a GMO crop that benefits small farms, and what do you think that would look like?
Well, the question was, is it possible to have a GMO crop that benefits small farms? What would that look like? As someone who represents small farmers, I'm not hearing anyone asking for it, frankly. I hear a lot of concern about risk. What is this going to do to our existing markets? Typically, small farms are engaged in more diversified agriculture, so a lot of your pest and types of problems, the kind of problems you may face, you can handle on a smaller scale with other techniques, even if you're not organic. So I'm not hearing small farmers, frankly, calling out for some new GMO crop. It's typically, again, in the Midwest commodity production zones where you're looking at monocultures across huge acreages. And so, if you're going to grow corn for ethanol in the Midwest, GMOs may be a great choice for you. As a farmer, it may have some benefits for you, but it's not going to feed anyone. But if you're a small diversified farmer in Oregon, hypothetically there could be some rotations that exist, but I don't think that, for the most part, I don't hear people asking for it.
And I could add to that the small farmers are more vulnerable to the kinds of competition, the risk of some adverse effect or trade feedback from contamination that affects our ability to export and trade. Small farmers are more vulnerable to those kinds of consequences than our large farmers in the Midwest.
I think that's right.
Let's thank our panelists. Thank
you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jager.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Goodbye. Okay, so now we're going to move on to our last panel of the evening. So I would like to invite up our panelists. So each of these panelists will speak for about 5 minutes, and then we will have a final Q&A time. We're going to be trying to finish up by 8:30. Our first panelist tonight is Rabbi Deborah Kolodny from Congregation Panai of Portland. Panai Or of Portland.
Panai Or. So there are 6 principles that can be drawn from Hebrew texts, Jewish texts, that I want to focus on tonight in response to what we've heard so far. 4 of them are from the scriptures, the Torah, and 2 are from our Talmud. The first that I want to focus on is that Torah herself describes and therefore delights in a gloriously interdependent ecosystem, one that's intentionally created, or one might say intelligently created so. One proof text is Psalm 104. A portion of that psalm reads, "You make springs gush forth in torrents. They make their ways between the hills, giving drink to all the wild beasts. The wild donkeys quench their thirst. The birds of the sky dwell beside them and sing among the foliage. You water the mountains from your loftiest sources. The earth is fulfilled with the fruit of your work. You make grass grow for the cattle and grain for human labor, that we may get food out of the earth. Wine that cheers the human heart, oil that makes the face shine, and bread that sustains human life." In addition to the descriptors of such a gloriously interdependent, biologically diverse ecosystem, we also have an agricultural system described wherein every 7 years the land is to lie fallow, a sabbatical year, a Shemitah year, foreshadowing current knowledge about allowing the earth to replenish itself by allowing it to lie fallow. There is also commentary that we are to be Shomrei Adamah, guardians of the earth. And this is a principle, there is a counter or a contradictory principle of being masters over the earth, to have dominion over all of the beasts. But when one encounters 2 competing theological principles in text, one must ask, well, what is the preponderance of the evidence in the rest of the text directing us towards? And I would assert that the guardianship of the earth, as opposed to mastery and dominion of the earth, is what our Torah describes. The 2 principles that I want to lift up in our Talmud flow beautifully with 2 ideas that we heard about tonight already. One is the precautionary principle. Jewish law, as extrapolated in the Talmud, goes to great lengths to insist that no harm ever be done under any circumstances as a result of anything anyone does. So, a prime example of the precautionary principle that is articulated over and over again is if you build a building and it has a flat roof, you must build a parapet. You must build a guardrail around that flat roof lest anybody fall off. So modern tort lawyers would just be delighted with the Talmud. Truly, when every risk is to be avoided in the social sphere. The second principle, Talmudic principle, that I wanted to lift up connects to the conversation we've been having about labeling. A huge portion of an entire tractate of the Talmud, the tractate called Bava Metzia, deals with commercial activity. And a primary principle repeated over and over and over again is that deception in commerce is prohibited. People must know what it is they are buying. Now, back then they were talking about the old wine and the new wine and which kind of wine was in the top of the cask, lest you defraud the purchaser. so they must make sure that they know the quality and thickness and age of their wine. But the same applies today, obviously, in the labeling arena. So I don't want to make any judgments about the principles that I've just articulated, but I wanted to lift them up as frameworks for us when we discuss the questions that are arising around GMOs.
Our second panelist is Gulzar Ahmed, who is the co-founder of the Islamic Society of Greater Portland.
In the name of God, the most beneficent, the most merciful. Good evening. Assalamu alaikum, which means may blessings and peace of God Almighty be on you. In Islam, there is a concept of halal, which is permissible, and haram, which is not permissible. The Quran has many passages regarding food ethics, specifically stressing that food must be good, it must be pure and wholesome, and tayyib in Arabic means wholesome. In Quran chapter 2, verse 168, it says, O ye people, eat of what that is on earth, lawful and good. It says in chapter 30, verse 30, so set thy face to the religion, one of pure faith, God's original upon which he originated humankind. There is no changing God's creation. That is the right religion, but most men know it not. So there is a debate among scholars if GM foods are permissible. In Quran, modifying living things is a sin. However, if the purpose is of necessity or welfare of all, then such a modification may be permissible. Whether certain GM food is halal depends if the source of modification is halal. Certainly, if the source is haram, then that food will be haram. But that is just part of it. Even though the source may be halal, genetic modification shall render food less than wholesome, incomplete, and changed. But during the time of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, the farmers of Medina were grafting different varieties of date palm seedlings. They were doing it to produce higher yields and resistance. He told them not to do it because it will be better. So they did not do it. And harvest was lacking. They mentioned it to him, and he said, I'm only a human being like you. If I tell you to do something with regards to religion, listen to me. But if I tell you something that's based on my own opinion, I'm only a human being. So what do we learn from it? Number one, first, during the time of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, people were changing food crops through selective breeding. And I'm sure that during the time of Prophet Moses and Prophet Jesus, peace be upon him, peace be upon them both, genetic breeding was being practiced. It's an old art. Okay? So that's point number one. Point number two is the prophet changed his position and admitted that he did not have the knowledge in agriculture and farming. Okay? So therefore, what do we learn from? Listen to the people who know, the scientists. Listen to them. That's directly what we deduce from this example. So today, Muslim scholars argue that there is a number of issues related to GMO. Just like Christians, just like other faiths, they all have not settled on this yet, right? They all argue. So the first thing is reliance and dependence on GM companies. Genetic engineering companies have IP rights on seeds. They make seeds who are inert. You cannot grow from them. So you're forced to buy seeds next year. Every year you're forced to buy seeds. Okay, well, it may be good for rich nations, but for poor nations, poor countries, and poor farmers, it may not be practical. Okay, that's one challenge. The second is, some argue that GMOs are actually beneficial. Well, we have heard from the experts that we don't know, long-term effect. That's horseless carriage, Long-time effect of these items have not been studied. We know introduction of allergens and toxins to the food, accidental contamination between genetically modified and non-genetically modified food, antibiotic resistance, adversely changing the nutrient contents of a crop, creation of super weeds and other environmental risks. So along with benefits, you have those challenges. So in conclusion, Muslim scholars must collaborate with scientists. They must collaborate with scientists to come up with recommendations as to the permissibility of GM foods. In the meantime, knowledge of which food is GM is very important. Consumers have the right to know. And therefore, labeling of food products is important for the consumers to make up their own mind. And that's why Right to Know Measure 92 on the ballot is very important that this gets passed. Thank you very much.
And our final panelist tonight is Rick North. Rick North is the former project director of the Oregon Physicians for Social Responsibilities Campaign for Safe Food.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for the opportunity. I'm wearing 3 hats tonight. One was just mentioned. For 7.5 years, I worked for Oregon Physicians for Social Responsibility. The first thing I say is I am not a doctor or a scientist. I just work with them all the time. Talking about biases, I have a bias. We did not believe for 1 minute that genetically engineered foods had been demonstrated safe for human health or the environment. And I'll say that up front. We very strongly believe in the precautionary principle. We don't think the testing had been done. That's one hat. Second, thank you for that. Another bias, I am on the steering committee of Measure 92 to label genetically engineered foods as a volunteer. But my third hat is as a Unitarian and a faith connection here. And for as many talks as I've done on GMOs and other aspects related to this, I've never done one religiously connected. So I went to, if you know anything about Unitarians, we don't have a Torah or a Quran or Bible. We will draw from all of them. We draw from all the great wisdom of the world. And you don't have to believe something to be a Unitarian, except kind of a search for truth. You do not have to believe in God. Many do. You do not have to believe in Jesus Christ as a Savior. Some do. You can be an agnostic, you can be an atheist, you can be a deist. But what we all have in common are what we call the 7 principles. And these are our guidelines for living. And this is what we adhere to very closely in our search for truth and justice. And I'm just going to pick one principle and connect it. This discussion has not come up the whole that I've seen before. The 4th principle is a free and responsible search for truth and meaning. And this is where we get our reputation for Garrison Keillor jokes, walking around with clipboards and looking for all this, and the joke that when the Unitarian family moved into a new house, the neighborhood bigots burned a question mark in their front yard. So yeah, these are Unitarians. That's us. So I'm going to tell you two stories here that point to this. One is a letter from a group of 26 corn insect specialists to the EPA. This happened just a few years ago, 2009. And they were complaining to the EPA. And I should say almost all of them withheld their names because of fear. And I'm just going to read a couple of quotes. I want you to hear it in their words, because they couldn't get the seeds and from GMOs that they wanted to get for independent research. Here's a few quotes. No truly independent research can be legally conducted on many critical questions, because they had to have ties to the biotech firms. If a company can control the research that appears in the public domain, they can reduce the potential negatives that can come out of any research. Last quote, the companies, quote, have the potential to launder the data, the information that is submitted to EPA. These scientists were pretty much scared to death, but they did it anyway because they were so tied into this that, oh, excuse me, I do have one more quote. Quote, people, the scientists, are afraid of being blacklisted. If your sole job is to work on corn insects and you need the latest corn varieties and the companies decide not to give it to you, you can't do your job. In other words, if you dare cross the biotech firms too much, your career could be in jeopardy. Okay? It's 2009. A few slight adjustments have been made, but by and large, if you try to buck the companies and try to do research, independent research, chances are you're not going to be able to, because those companies are going to tell you, you got to pass your results and findings through us first. And very few scientists are willing to do that because they don't want that kind of arrangement. That's one story. Another has probably been the biggest scientific controversy of the last couple of years. It involves a French scientist by the name of Gilles-Eric Seralini. Monsanto in Europe had developed a Roundup-ready corn that they submitted to Europe, and they said, well, we've done the safety testings on this, find a few little things, but nothing to worry about. Don't worry, we think it's safe for human health. The European agency took a look, it's kind of accepted there. Okay, well, we think it's safe for human consumption. Seralini got a look at the raw data. He was seeing things that were very disturbing. He said, I'd like to do a little further testing on this. And he actually got the chance to do it. And what Monsanto had done, which is absolutely typical for the biotech industry, they had tested on rats for 90 days. They said, okay, well, we've done the testing. This is very typical, done around the world by the biotech firms. Yeah, we're not seeing much. We saw a little bit here, a little difference. Not much of a big deal here. Seralini said, no, we're going to take this out to 2 years. Let's do the long-term effects, which almost nobody has done. Let's take it out past 90 days. Let's see what we find here. And he was testing both the corn itself and Roundup. And what he found was, after that 90 days, what starts popping up? Tumors, liver damage, kidney damage, premature death. This is what he found. He had this published in a peer-reviewed journal, and he's immediately attacked by virtually the entire biotech industry. 3 reasons. He said, well, you're not using the right kind of rats. It's the same rats that have been used all over the world. Okay? Well, your samples are too small. You're not using enough rats. Same size is typically done in toxicology all around the world. And finally, the journal. So much pressure put on that journal, they retracted his study. And then the pro-biotech scientists say, see, oh, this thing's garbage. And the reason they said they retracted the study is because he didn't have any definitive conclusions on this. Well, if you look at most scientific studies, they're not going to say our word is the last word. They're going to say we think we need further tests. scientific outrage over this. And the Europeans have now decided, they're going to put in a €3 million study to further test Seralini. We're going to help find out what we've needed all along. And I do this as a preface to Measure 92. Because if you go back to the Unitarian principle, a free and responsible search for truth and meaning, absolutely, we have the right to know what's in our food. We have that right. And that right is trying to be kept from us. 64 countries have that right. They're already doing it. 3 states have already passed laws. They're already doing it. 24 states introduced bills. We have that right. We have that right to free truth and free seeking of the truth. And that's what it's all about. And that has not been the case when it comes to GMOs. And it's time we started changing that. And this Measure 92 is the way to do it. One way to start. Thank you.
Okay, we have about 10 minutes for questions and answers, so I'm going to come around with this.
I just wanted to, Mr. Ahmad, I appreciate that you bring up how the cultivating GMOs may increase our dependence and reliance on companies. And the question of selling off our seeds and our future, the genetic material, that seems to be something that's really harder to quantify. So I really appreciate bringing that up. And I was just struck because Rabbi Kolodny talked about the value of an interdependence with nature, whereas what you seem to bring up, Mr. Ahmad, is about a one-way dependence of us, of the poorer folks, on the companies for food, for seeds, for our genetic material that's our future. I was just struck by that contrast. Dependence or interdependence?
Any other questions? You guys did this on purpose, opposite ends of the room.
So I guess first, just wanted to thank all of you for presenting. It was really helpful for me because I don't really know too much about the topic. One thing, though, from a spiritual perspective is that, organic farming to me is really important. And, I'm all for the right to know, but one thing that I think is escaping me and I'm questioning, and I just wanted to add this for further dialogue, is that for crops and what have you that's not organic, that's using pesticides, is what effect does pesticides have in our body as well? And that's something that I'm concerned about from a genetic standpoint, from a standpoint of what does it actually do to our body? Well, not sure if all of you know about the Dirty Dozen, but each year comes out with the 12 fruits and vegetables and what have you that use the most pesticides or the worst pesticides. And we don't actually know for crops that are not organic what's actually happening to our body when we use these crops. So it's something that's concerning to me too from a spiritual perspective, is that if we get back to our roots when we just grew everything naturally, that's kind of getting lost in this, and figured I would just kind of inform with that as well. Thank you.
Yeah, I would like to say a couple, just one thing. Basically, this first paragraph that I read from Quran, I read it again. O ye people, eat of what is on earth, lawful and good. And by that good means wholesome, means unaltered, means without any adulteration, any pesticides, any of that stuff. So it's really, it's really a tayyib food or a pure food is really recommended. And that's why I think organic stuff is very good.
I just want to say that I agree with your sentiments, and I'm not really going to respond from a religious point of view, but from the point of view of somebody who used to research biological pest control when I was in college, and say that whenever there is a less impactful, clearly safe alternative, I think it's incumbent upon us to seek out ways to grow that safe alternative. And organic farming and the use of, as I mentioned, biological pest control and intercrop planting are mechanisms that have not, I'm really glad to hear there are 550 organic farms, but there are 38,000 farms in Oregon. So it's still such a small percentage of the agricultural world, and Oregon is in better shape than a lot of other states. So yes, I agree.
And just to add to what Ervin said today about the announcement today that this new crop that's going to be resistant to 2,4-D. About 2 weeks ago, I heard a Vietnam vet speak who was affected. His baby was born with birth defects because he was over in Vietnam when they dropped the Agent Orange, which 2,4-D is a major component of. Okay, 2,4-D use is now most likely going to skyrocket in the United States, and this is from the USDA itself. And of course, I've got a lot of disagreements with the USDA, so they're not exactly opposed to GMOs. It is this chemical treadmill. All these things that they said were safe at one time. The DDT, oh, it's safe, don't worry about it. The PCBs, not a pesticide. Oh, they're safe, don't worry about them. No, not all of them are. We find out more things later on, and I'm not an expert on every single kind of pesticide. I do know this, though, that there has been very little long-term testing on a lot of these things, BT being one of them. And here's a visual aid. Is there anybody in this room that if you walked into Freddy's or Safeway and bought this ear of corn, anybody in this room that would know whether it was genetically engineered or not? No. There's nobody in the city of Portland that would know. There's nobody in the entire state of Oregon or the entire United States that would know because you don't have it labeled. So people can look at the same data I've looked at, same scientific data, and I studied it a lot, and can come to a different conclusion that say, hey, I think they're safe. I think it's enough. Don't worry so much about the precautionary principle, and maybe you're just being unnecessarily careful. That's okay. You don't have to agree with me on this. All I'm saying is let's give the citizens the right to know, and that way we can make our own decisions based on our own beliefs, whether they're religious or whatever.
I've been working with ancient texts, but I do want to lift up that a modern Jewish leader, Rabbi Zalman Schachter Shalomi, who just passed in July, coined the phrase eco-kashrut. And he asked the question, if something is farmed with pesticides or is farmed in a manner that is inhumane in terms of how workers are treated, or if animals are not treated humanely, can that food be considered kosher, even though the Torah didn't imagine these kinds of questions? And his answer was absolutely not, that the use of pesticides and herbicides and the putting workers in harm's way from both of those, as well as any other, as well as just dishonest or unsafe working conditions, that none of that could be considered kosher. And kosher is the Jewish equivalent of halal, and translated as fit for use. So we have our ancient text, and we also have our modern interpretations. And while I never had a conversation with Reb Zalman about GMOs, if he had the information in front of him that's been presented tonight, I'm quite sure he would say that that was not kosher.
Okay, this will have to be our final question.
Yes, you can know if that corn is genetically engineered, if it's organic. The federal definition of organic excludes the genetically engineered ingredients. Go to Fred Meyer and go to the organic section and buy the corn there. I'm very concerned that there's a lot of conflating going on between two, I think, distinct issues. One is the technology of genetic engineering itself, and the other is American agriculture. They should be separated. But a lot of people seem to assume that there's something intrinsically risky about the process of GE foods. It has been said a couple of times that has never been shown to be true. The term genetic modification, our species have been genetically modifying plants and animals for thousands of years. And no concerns, anything like this, have been raised about the older, simpler processes, which are crossbreeding mainly. There's also another technology that's been used called mutagenic development of crops, where radiation is applied to cause mutations that may result in superior crops. Nobody talks about that. So there's an assumption that there's something intrinsically risky about this technology. Speaking of biases, my bias is I have never seen any proof that that is the case. Now, there are valid concerns about how agriculture is practiced, and the guy, I forget his name, who's from the Friends of Family Farmers, brought up some very valid concerns about the practical effects on farmers. That is important. I just want to mention one other thing now. I rather expect this measure to pass. I'm voting against it because I think it's misleading. It sort of feeds the unjustified fear about the technology that is used for these crops. However, I think it will pass. But anybody who wants to avoid genetically engineered, and that's the term that's used in the measure, not GMO, not genetic modification, by organic. By definition, organic excludes GMO.
Yeah, if I could respond, well, certainly. I don't disagree that if you go to the organic section of the supermarket and something is labeled organic, sure. No, I don't disagree with that at all. Most people will not. Most people are buy conventional corn, and that's the corn I was referring to. A lot of people cannot afford organic. So it becomes an economic issue and a social justice issue. And if you go to the conventional section of the supermarket, you cannot tell. Nobody can. You know, in terms of you're certainly entitled to your beliefs and like that, you know, that's okay. That's okay. You know, we may disagree. We certainly disagree on the science. I do believe very strongly in the precautionary principle, where I think the burden of proof is to demonstrate that the foods are safe before they're put on the market, not to put them on the market first and have to prove that they're harmful. To me, it's just better safe than sorry. It's that simple. And when we have a food regulatory system in the United States, where even the FDA says it is the ultimate responsibility of the food manufacturer to demonstrate the safety of these foods. This means we are putting our faith in the likes of Monsanto to say, oh, these are safe. Don't worry about it, these are safe. And on a voluntary basis, they don't even have, it's not even mandatory, they do these safety testings. And when they purposely choose to do it in 90 days instead of further on, this is the kind of thing that goes on. And I'm sorry, I don't trust them. And I don't like the way things have been going so far. I think it needs to be changed, and I think Measure 92 is a good way to start that change.
And I agree with that. In Europe, GM foods are considered unnatural, and they are considered to be harmful until proven otherwise. In US, GM foods are considered natural and not harmful until proven otherwise. So I don't know who to believe, you know, but here is they're banned in Europe and many other countries, you know. I'm originally from Pakistan. My farm, my family farm over there, we grow cotton, right? And I believe they use this, you know, genetically modified corn, not corn, I'm sorry, cotton, okay? And each year I hear the stories of the worms, which seems to be more horrible next year and the year after. They are kind of like you know, bigger and bigger and bigger worms, and plenty of them, even with that genetically modified. You know, so they are mutating. They are learning to live with it, and they are eating it up. You know, and so the question is, do we know the long-term effect of this thing? You know, yes, it's okay for 4 or 5 years, but what about 30 years of consuming the same thing over and over and over and over? Are you willing to take that risk? That's the question I have.
Okay, I'm going to ask us to thank this panel. Thank you. And I'm going to invite Jenny Holmes from Ecumenical Ministries of Oregon's Interfaith Food and Farm Partnership to come close us out.
Well, thanks again to all our panelists and to Derek Moyer and his associates, David Terrell at Warner Pacific. We really appreciate this opportunity for partnership. And I hope that we've modeled to some degree how people of faith can come together and have a constructive, well-informed discussion about issues of our day. And I just want to reinforce that although there is a ballot measure coming up this on GMOs, this forum is intended to provide a launching point for a long-term conversation about the human relationship with genetic engineering and what the boundaries, limits, and most importantly, what the questions are that people of faith should be asking. There's a lot of technical information, but for people of faith, our traditions inform us of what are the right questions to be asking. And the question of risk and boundaries, what kind of values are we wanting to sustain and protect, and what is our proper role on this earth that we are blessed with inhabiting. So to end, I want to share a prayer that conveys a sense of the completeness and the goodness of this world and calls into question the role of human beings in altering it. How do we know when we've made something better? When do we know when we've made something worse? And God saw everything he had made and found it very good. And he said, "This is a beautiful world that I have given you. Take good care of it. Do not ruin it." It is said, "Before the world was created, the Holy One kept creating worlds and destroying them. Finally, he created this one and was satisfied and said to Adam, 'This is the last world I shall make. I place it in your hands. Hold it in trust.'" Amen.